To get started, we have Nupur Raval here with us. She's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the AI Now Institute at New York University. She received her PhD in informatics from the University of California, Irvine last year. And as I mentioned earlier, is the co-PI on the Mapping Digital Labor project. She has been engaged with CIS previously, donning a different hat with the Access to Knowledge project, and we're extremely pleased to have her join us for today's discussions as a moderator. Over to you, Nupur.
Thank you, Ayush. So I'll just make brief introductions and then yield the floor to the presenters. And I'll probably spend a minute or two just explaining where and how this project was conceptualized. So about the project, I think it definitely came out of the time that I was doing my field work between 2016 and 2020, I guess, yeah. And as I did some of the individual field work, I began to realize that this is such an emergent, nascent area, and that, of course, what I was going to do in my own dissertation work was part of it, but I also felt like there had to be a broader inquiry around digital and algorithmic transformation through gig work platforms such as Uber, Ola, Swiggy, Zomato, etc. And that's kind of what led to conversations between Sumandro and I. And we thought that it would be a great idea to kind of write up this grant proposal and try and do a broader inquiry. And the other sort of thing that I would mention is, again, that the ways in which I think that this project culminated and the things that we attended to are slightly different from the dominant strain of gig economy research in different parts of the world and different disciplines is that we're explicitly...
Nupur, your voice is fading a bit. I don't know if that's...
Oh, sorry. Just give me a second.
Yeah, this is better, actually.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so the other way that we were also, I think the project has turned out slightly differently, or its contributions have been different to understanding the gig economy, is that we very explicitly wanted to attend to the social and cultural aspects of what happens between people in the gig economy and how people work in it or who depend on it for their own consumption, reproduction, etc. How it transforms their subjectivities, essentially. So those are kind of the two things that definitely inform and mark this project and its findings. And now, just to quickly introduce the three fellows who were selected as a part of this project and who conducted comparative fieldwork, mostly across Delhi and Mumbai. I'll introduce them very quickly. So in no particular order, the first person is Simran, who will be speaking shortly. Simran is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. And prior to that, she's worked as a qualitative ethnographic researcher on a freelance basis and was associated with Microsoft Research, BBC Media Action, and has taught undergraduate courses in social sciences. The second presenter is Anushri. Anushri Gupta is a PhD scholar at the Department of Liberal Arts at IIT Hyderabad. She's interested in exploring technologies as cultural artifacts and their intersections with labor and placemaking. And her current research focuses on techno-entrepreneurialism in the urban context, as human India. Last but not least is Sara Zia, who is an independent researcher and a journalist with a leading English daily in India. Her research interests include media, mobility, and digital ethnography. So yeah, I guess I can invite Ayush and Ambika to begin the first session. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Nupur. Pranav, could you share our presentation? Right, so this is the first of two projects that we are presenting, as Ayush had mentioned as well. So a little bit of background on the research. Pranav, can we move to the next slide? So the project was hosted as part of the Feminist Internet Research Network that was sort of incubated by the Association for Progressive Communications, and we've been working on this for about 2 years now. And the fieldwork was all done pre-COVID, so some of the insights that we will be talking about are from that context as well, but do um, impact workers in the sort of post-COVID context as well. So, to start by talking a bit about why we were sort of why we started this project was the aim to assess the impact of digital platforms in the domestic work sector in particular. Because of the lack of focus on domestic workers, especially in the global south, as the sector witnesses the entry of a new intermediary, which is digital platforms. And we thought that this would be significant for two reasons. First, the domestic work sector is highly unorganized with very exploitative conditions of work. Um, and second, because workers also largely come from marginalized groups, including migrant women from Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi communities, and they tend to have very low bargaining power. So, given this precarity and also the historical presence of very exploitative intermediaries, that is, placement agencies who have been notorious for human trafficking and wage theft, we thought it would be important to understand how digital platforms are actually shifting the conditions of work, if at all. And so we had around 2 to 3 key research questions. So those are listed here: the impact of platforms on the domestic work supply chain, as well as on conditions of work, how platforms are shaping existing inequalities and reinforcing or ameliorating some of them, and what space there is for bargaining power, either collective or individual, for workers. So we also aim to develop our methodology and focused quite a bit on that. So we were drawing on feminist principles of knowledge production. So participation, intersectionality, and reflexivity were some of the key principles that we were hoping to implement. So we were working closely with a union partner, the Domestic Workers' Rights Union, as co-researchers on the project. I hope some of them are in the audience today as well. Um, so they were involved in the design of the research tools as well as the data collection process. And after receiving feedback from worker participants about the nature of the research, the process that they have been involved in, and the fact that it can be very extractive because there is a process that takes knowledge from participants without them being able to share in the end result of research. We also sought to build a process of knowledge exchange and are in the process of designing more accessible research outputs like brochures, posters, and WhatsApp shareable audio notes. Um, and in the next couple of minutes, Ayush and I will go over some of the key thematic areas from our research findings that have evolved out of over 65 interviews that we did with workers, companies, unions, and government representatives. Next slide, please. So to begin with, we created a typology of the business models and types of digital platforms. And here we find that while the business models that are popular in other sectors, so namely the on-demand model, which is similar to the Uber model where workers are placed in short-term gigs and platforms exercise a lot of control over the conditions of work. And the second one being marketplace platforms, where platforms are just performing a matching function between customers and workers. These exist in the domestic work sector, but they do tend to be shaped by the occupational context and history of this sector rather than vice versa. And we also find the existence of a third type of platform, which is digital placement agencies. And these are perhaps more unique to this sector as well as the Indian context. And these essentially just digitize the process of traditional placement agencies. So they place workers in regular, short, or long term placement in either part or full time gigs. And those are similar to the way in which domestic work has been historically organized as well. And we also find that platforms tend to amplify new forms of inequalities in addition to reinforcing older ones. So, for example, digital access is, of course, a fundamental constraint for women workers. And because of the fact that they tend to only have access to shared phones that are owned and used by the entire family. Um, and this is a barrier particularly for on-demand work, because that actually requires workers to have regular access to a phone throughout the day to be able to find any work at all through the platform. So we also find that workers in the on-demand segment actually have slightly higher wages than the other models, and also these wages are higher than the traditional domestic work sector. And this is partly owing to the professionalization of work, as quote unquote deep cleaning work through vacuuming and other technological tools that are built into this form of work. But we also find that it is simultaneously being masculinized. So all of the workers that we found, apart from one platform in Bangalore, all other large on-demand platforms only work with men in the cleaning segment, which is not uh, how the traditional sector is actually structured. And this has actually been found in other industries as well. For example, with computer science, the entry of men in the sector has been correlated with a rise in wages and increase in the social value attached to a job role, but then it does end up becoming masculinized as well. Um, and we find that marketplaces and digital placement agencies have managed to integrate some features that account for this digital divide. So there are women workers actually constitute a large workforce within the segment that is being placed by marketplaces and digital placement agencies, because their key demographic is women domestic workers who have functioned in the traditional sector as well and are now looking for work through digital platforms. So we find that they have recruitment practices like setting up onboarding camps in residential areas, where they manually collect information about workers and register them on platforms. But because of this, there is also a very strong information asymmetry between platforms and workers. And this is, of course, true for other sectors in the platform economy as well, the existence of an information asymmetry. But this is really stark in this space. So if you read the quote on the screen, then there were several workers that we spoke to who did not even know that they had been registered on the platform. They may have been registered by a relative or by a third party agency, and or if they have registered voluntarily, then they may not have any understanding of how the platform works. They may have just been in touch with a platform representative who has just registered them on the platform, and they were promised to be given a job but have not heard back from them in months. So that was actually the experience of a large number of workers that we spoke to within this segment. And this, of course, created a lot of distrust between platforms and workers, and was a very large disincentive for women workers to engage in the platform economy and look for economic opportunities through this space, because of the sort of anxieties that they had around being exploited, because they did not understand anything about this abstract technological tool. So they actually trusted word of mouth networks a lot more than digital platforms for finding regular term work. And so we find that despite making claims of revolutionizing the recruitment process and making it more efficient, um, there are very few platforms that are actually optimizing for the barriers that workers tend to face and creating relationships of trust with workers, but are actually sort of geared towards optimizing for customers' needs. So I'll end there and hand over to Ayush to speak a bit more about the impact of platform design on workers' everyday lives.
Thank you, Ambika. Uh, Picking up from sort of the idea of the occupational identity, I mean, sort of reorienting focus a little bit uh, to how like the code, how like design choices have like play this crucial role in the way in which workers' bodies are looked at and then sort of uh, manifest in the space of like sort of digital labor, we find that there are sort of two key ways in which the disembodiment of workers' bodies occurs, and one of them is uh, this disembodiment into workers' sort of intersectional demographic identities, and this primarily happens through sort of one-sided filtering and rating mechanisms. Now, and the other is through this sort of disembodiment into data flows uh, that largely happens through through expansive sort of technological capacities that platforms have. So what rating systems is something that, I mean, many of us who in the space and many of us who also use platforms have sort of first-hand sort of looked at and been witness to. In the space of domestic work platforms in particular, uh, the demographic characteristics of workers that include their caste and gender identities determine task constitution through these filtering tools that are typically provided on marketplace platforms as mobile phone applications and websites. Now, uh, most platforms allow customers to filter workers by gender, age, language, religion, and or the region or state that they belong to. Um, we found one platform in particular, Book My Housemates, that explicitly includes caste as a filtering characteristic as well. Now, it's fairly evident that most, if not all, of these personal characteristics of workers are unrelated to the quality of services that may be provided. What filtering tools then do is sort of marketize and value these personal characteristics in domestic labor markets, thereby then leading to discriminated differentiation of workers. Now, there were multiple perspectives that we heard, I mean, from across stakeholders operating in the space. So platform managers of and sort of creators of marketplace platforms did not view these as discriminatory at all, instead sort of deferring it to customer and employer demand. While some platform managers were explicit about not including caste and religion as filtering mechanisms, despite customer requests, they felt that adding other personal characteristics was one of the biggest value additions that marketplace platforms could provide. So, in many ways, these are sort of these have become indelible parts of how domestic work recruitment is happening through digital platforms. Now, there are the risk of this discrimination persists beyond the stage of recruitment, and this happens through rating systems, which have become a common feature of platforms across the gig economy and in the domestic work sector as well. These are an avenue for employers' sort of preconceived notions and biases to impact the quantum and type of opportunities offered to workers. And they also put workers at the risk of receiving ratings based on personal characteristics, which then has a significant impact on their labor market outcomes through these platforms. This has been evidenced in several other contexts where ratings on gig work platforms have been shown to be strongly correlated with gender and race identities of workers. And most platforms that we looked at strongly marketed their ability to provide like trusted and verified workers. And I mean, in what then can be sort of also looked at as the codification of the caste privileged gaze of employers of domestic workers in India. What workers' bodies also experience is incredible amounts of surveillance. While much has been sort of said and written about how algorithmic surveillance manifests on digital labor platforms, we find that there are several other modes through which surveillance is exacted upon domestic workers on digital platforms. So algorithmic surveillance does continue to be like a dominant form of surveillance. So on-demand, like domestic work platforms in particular, use like expansive computational systems for the management of workers. And in doing so, they seek to control and discipline the behavior of workers from the stage of task allocation to completion. Uh, Two platforms whose data flows we could identify to some degree of granularity, HouseJoy and Urban Company, constantly track workers' geographical location by accessing the GPS receiver in workers' smartphones, mandate before and after pictures from each cleaner, track the time at which workers reach the customer's home, note the start and end time of each task by mandating workers to manually enter this data, and require workers to ensure that the customers give them a high rating. I mean, Urban Company, in fact, goes ahead and prides itself on technological integration, some of which have been rolled out in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But what it does is that it's basically adding to its arsenal of surveillance tools. So, for example, last year they rolled out facial recognition for verification of workers on the platform. So workers now on Urban Company are required to take a selfie before starting a task, and this image is then run through a facial recognition software to verify uh, workers' identities. This surveillance by Urban Company also extends to predicting the usage of cleaning products and inventory by workers, and then mandating them to procure uh, and replenish their inventory from Urban Company itself. In addition to algorithmic surveillance, we find that each of the three types of platforms have human managers as well. However, the role and extent of managerial surveillance varies. Uh, Interventions of managers on on-demand platforms are mediated through outcomes of algorithmic surveillance generally. So workers report receiving calls from managers to activate a phone that has been dormant for some time, reallocating workers to further off geographies sort of their from their area of residence, where to locations where there may be a surplus of jobs, and even at the stage of resolving customer grievances. However, consistent assistance, either algorithmic or human, is usually unavailable to workers. The third kind of surveillance that we can identify is that of customer surveillance, and this manifests through the offer of verified and trusted professionals, service packages that allow customers to pay platforms for organizing police and background hires of prospective hires. Domestic workers are also obsessively reliant on these systems to establish credibility, assuage class anxieties, and discipline unwanted behaviors. Interfaces on technology heavy on demand platforms also allow customers to track workers' real time location. Compounding all of these modes of surveillance, women domestic workers on digital platforms also have to grapple with surveillance by men in their families. So, what we are understanding as domestic surveillance, this occurs along two axes. One is that of the use of mobile phones itself, wherein several Indian households, mobile phones are a shared asset, access to which is controlled by a male member of the family. And the other is through controlling women's mobility in the labor market and entry into the labor market itself. So TaskCorp is one platform that we identified. It sends an SMS to a women worker's husband every time she receives a job posting, due to the discomfort of men in the family in not having knowledge of their wives' exact whereabouts. Uh, all of this has, I think, far-reaching implications for how we think about policymaking in the space around academic thought and advocacy strategies, and also speaks to some of these legal distinctions that are being created between sort of employment and contractor relationship, which do boil down to the degree of control that is exercised uh, by employers over workers. With that, I will pause and open the floor up for any questions or feedback at this point. Pranav, could you stop at the research team slide, please? Yeah, I think we have Geeta here from DWRU, um, uh, who were co-researchers on the project, as Ambika mentioned earlier. Um, the design direction for the report was undertaken by Akash Shadri, uh, who's like a full-time designer at CIS, and the illustrations that you see were created by Shruti Lal. Thank you for listening in.
So I think we have we have one hand up. Uh, should we allow? And to talk, Pranav, can are you? Yeah, Manish, I think
Yeah,
you
hello.
can. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I give you a brief introduction about me. One of my friend has suggested this particular webinar, and I am a founder and CEO of a platform called Gigzoo. It's an application which connects to domestic gig workers to household workers, household customers. Okay, and we have been doing this uh, particular this work since October to 2020, and many of your research points are quite valid in terms the problems associated with the the social psychological uh, you know, or the uh, behavioral aspects of a gig worker, domestic gig workers. So it's quite right, and we are also facing the similar problems. No, and how we are solving those kind of a social behavior or the psychological behavior. So in terms that first of all, all these people are what we define in our labor terminology is unskilled workers. They are not skilled in terms, whether if they are cook or drivers, and they are skilled. Otherwise, domestic cleaners and all, we call them unskilled. So one of our philosophy which we drive is that see the unseen skilled in an unskilled worker. So there is some kind of a skill in that person. You can't deny that. That is our one of the philosophy. Apart from that, our tagline is Karam Samman Vishwas. So overall, our model is focused on how we can improve the lifestyle of our domestic gig workers, how we can help them, because how they get a job, how a female, as you say, no, particularly working in that domestic circuit, how she get a job. Generally, she get a job
Hi,
through
Manish.
references.
Hi,
Yeah.
Manish. So sorry. As the moderator, I just, in the interest of time, I would
Yeah.
like you to come to your question first,
So,
and
so,
then
so yeah.
maybe we
So
can talk
my
about.
my
Yeah.
my understanding basically from the past 1 year is that uh, I think there is a trust issue between the gig worker because of the crime rate in that particular sector and the customer. So unless and until we can build that trust, between the customer as well as between the gig workers, till the time we can't solve these social issues in terms whether it's a Hindu Muslim worker requirement, or whether there are separate lifts in the societies. We are seeing that there are separate lifts together in the society where they say you need to travel to that lift, you can't travel to the passenger lift. So all these things, discrimination are there, and it tends to show the trust deficit between both these categories. But that's my take.
Right, should we just take one more question and then I think we can take the rest of the questions on chat just in the interest of time. So I think Prem,
Hi, yes. Am I audible?
yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think there were some really interesting points there. And one thing which comes up to me, so I've done some work with gig workers in a couple of different places, but also in specifically in Canada, in Vancouver. And one difference that, or something that comes up repeatedly, even among gig workers themselves, is that to kind of use the language that these platforms use themselves is that it affords them a degree of flexibility in their work. Right? It allows them a degree of choosing their own hours or choosing when they want to work, when they want to do this sort of work, or they might have another job that allows them to have a more regular schedule, and then to fill out their hours they might do this sort of gig work. So I was just wondering if that sort of questions or that sort of self uh, is that an important aspect among gig workers in India? Is that something that is disciplined by these platforms to an extent that that no longer is even a question among gig workers. That,
Yeah, thanks for that question, Prem. Ayush, did you want to go ahead?
Sorry, I dropped off for a second between. Could you just quickly repeat that question for me?
I think he was just asking about whether flexibility and the fact that workers might be able to enjoy flexibility in the platform economy is important for domestic workers, and I think a short answer to that is yes, but largely in cases where workers are only treating platforms as a side gig, or they are it's not the primary form of uh, either earning livelihoods or looking for work. So in those cases, yes, there we did find instances of workers who were quite happy with um, the fact that they could earn some additional income, but that is not the case when they are relying on platforms full time because of the amount of time they have to spend looking for work. Then that flexibility is not something that they enjoyed as much.
Yeah, I just to add like two quick points to that, very briefly. One is that I think I mean the flexibility sort of the flexibility discourse is sort of treated as antithetical to workers' protection and rights, and that should not be the case. So flexibility is important, and as you can see with how domestic work has been organized, typically there have been multiple employers, but that too has come with sort of the simultaneous erosion of rights, but that need not necessarily be the case. And the sort of second sort of slightly different point is that uh, like flexibility on digital platforms is fairly illusory. So we see with many platforms that that workers are stuck in a vicious debt cycle, and b with security deposits that they're unable to claim back. So that kind of agency and choice that is necessary to be able to make the most of flexibility just simply does not exist. Yeah, but having that, none of that changes the fact that flexibility is desirable, but how do we conceptual think about flexibility is what uh, is I feel what is paramount at this point.
So just in the interest of time, I think we should move to the next presentation. And there's a lot of questions on chat, so we'll just respond there.
Good. Pranav, can you share the screen again, I think? Or should we just proceed with the first presentation?
I could
I think,
start. Okay, Pranav?
yeah. Simran, will you be able to share screen?
I think so, yes. Does this work?
It's starting on my screen.
Hello, does this work?
Yes, yeah, it says you started screen sharing. Simran, we can't see your screen anymore.
Oh, I'll try resharing. Does this work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm not sure where you are, but today I'm going to speak about based on my fieldwork in Bombay with food delivery workers. I want to think of the promise and the prescriptions of working on food delivery platforms. platform companies themselves have often spoken about the promise of work offering freedom and so on. And researchers and activists generally look at the prescriptions that platforms have for workers and then analyze those promises according to the prescriptions of platforms. So in the same spirit, I want to analyze the promise of platforms, but a different kind of promise. Since I'm studying food delivery platforms, I'm interested in the work of feeding and being fed, which historically has been work that happens within the household by members of the family. Generally, women do this work. This is not to say that platforms have marketized the household. We know from Ayush Nambika's work and other social scientists' work that domestic workers and cooks, even before platforms, have been doing this work of some work of care and feeding households. And that work has been, customers have been able to very actively screen workers on the basis of caste, religion, because food is a volatile site of culture and labor. And so what food delivery platforms do, interestingly, is to open up this work, which is not only work that used to be done within the household and I mean still continue to be done within the household, but it opens up this work to people, to women as well as men across religions and castes. So that's the promise of platforms, the promise of opening up the work to different kinds of workers that I'm interested in examining. And I will compare that promise with the prescriptions that platforms have for workers. These prescriptions, I've arrived at them based on some qualitative ethnographic fieldwork between January and May 2019. This was with, of course, food delivery platform-based workers, but also delivery workers who work in restaurants, fast food chains, as well as Puripis, which are South Indian upper caste owned food establishments, very popular in Mumbai. And I've also done some fieldwork with food delivery platform support workers. So that would include a team leader in the case of Zomato, various support workers in platform offices. So for instance, a fleet manager or even auditors who randomly arrive at spaces that food delivery workers congregate in to check their grooming standards. So on the basis of this, this was my sample. In the report, you find that in the first half of the section that I've written, I've sort of focused on the platform worker relationship across 3 platforms, Swiggy, Zomato, and Uber Eats, in terms of, so I describe their organizational structures and what these mean for the platform worker relationship. So for instance, Uber Eats does not have any mediatory figure like Zomato. Zomato has a team leader, so Uber Eats only has one head office, and so one half of the draft is about organizational structure and what it means. But the other half, and that's the half that I want to delve into the presentation, is about what platforms prescribe in this relationship. So there are two parts of this prescription. One is what workers' appearances and their demeanor, and the other is their use and experience of time or temporal orders of this work. So the first prescription about what workers look like, it's very obvious that the uniforms that workers wear, uniforms are just T-shirts with company branding, as well as so branding in the sense of the logo of the company, as well as the colors that they use. You can see it in the photograph here. So workers themselves acknowledge that this branding and their uniform is a means of advertising for companies, and companies can actively spend less on advertising because workers are wearing this uniform. Another aspect of appearances is the imposition of grooming standards, which is basically wear full pants, preferably no ripped jeans, wear closed shoes, no funky hair color, and with these grooming standards and uniform, they seem to serve a social function of an identity card. So a working class man, mostly young man now, will not be stopped at the residential complex's gate, but looking at his t-shirt, it's a form of identity card. It's a form of identity, providing your identity, which allows a working class man access into a residential building or into an office complex, spaces that would otherwise make him wait out and would delay his entry. But at the same time, the uniform that is an identity card and eases access also creates problems in two areas. One is the mall. So certain malls in my sample had banned food delivery workers. And they did so because they said that food delivery workers lingering in the food court waiting for the order to get ready or lingering outside the restaurant spoils the presentation of the mall. And so they wanted the delivery workers to wait outside, not outside the main gate, however, outside a back gate where all the cargo and the other material is loaded. So that's where workers would congregate. And how would the orders then go magically from the restaurant to the worker standing downstairs? Would be they had devised a system of mall boys. So in the case of Zomato and Swiggy, there were people specifically employed for this purpose that they would they were in plain clothes. Interestingly, they would ferry orders between the mall and the workers. So this was an instance of how the uniform becomes, on one hand, provides access, but also in certain spaces, it makes access impossible. The other was the case of the way the traffic police read the uniform. So a lot of workers said that the traffic police often saw the uniform as, the traffic police had an imagination that workers would be speeding because they would want to finish the delivery quickly. And so even when they were not at fault, they would get fined quite often. So in the case of this photograph, a worker told me that they were fined for not wearing a helmet. And when they looked into the fine, they saw the photographic evidence that the cop had attached to the fine, and they were pretty clearly wearing a helmet. So this just goes to show that there is a sense that they get profiled of being disrespectful of civic norms, and the uniform is often the quickest way to profile the food delivery worker. So it's interesting that even in this quote, you can see that there is a role that's been created for a Starbucks captain, and this captain essentially wears the Starbucks uniform and is employed by the platform, stands in the coffee shop, and again mediates between the coffee shop and the delivery worker standing outside. So the delivery worker cannot go into a Starbucks because apparently people who order from Starbucks have a certain standard of people they interact with, and only someone wearing a Starbucks uniform can be in the Starbucks space. This is interesting because this coffee shop camouflage, if I can call it that, says that it's not just a question of branding, but also that a lot of the prescriptions of platforms are big, especially with respect to workers' appearances, and where they are seen, revolve around existing norms in service work and on what platforms anticipate customers might want. This is one of the first prescriptions that I'm interested in, and the second is that of temporality and workers' use and experience of time. So it's interesting to note that in delivery workers who work off platforms, so in restaurants and UDPs and so on, generally have two peaks during the workday. One would be around lunch and one would be around dinner, perhaps even around breakfast, but more so during lunch and dinner. But with app-based works, it's not just meal times that are peak times, but because when there's bad weather or it's very rainy, there's traffic, there are festivals, sporting events, all the times that it's inconvenient for someone to leave home are also peak times. Now, these peak times correspond to the kinds of incentives. There are boosts in incentives around these times. So the platforms want workers to be around, ready to deliver, and they communicate these peaks to workers through these heat maps, like the one in the photograph, constantly nudging workers to go where there are more orders. And these are obviously not polite nudges, because if you don't take the instruction, then you face either your ID will be disabled or it will be blocked. Interestingly, there's also pressure to move around even in off-peak times. And a team leader, when I attended a huddle led by a team leader of delivery, a huddle of delivery workers, he kept reminding delivery workers that the orders don't look for you, you have to look for the orders. So it seems that the use and experience of time in food delivery work seems to make waiting an impossibility. So the only way to really use time legitimately is to use it legibly, to keep looking for orders. Whereas if you worked in an UDP or restaurant, waiting was a pretty routine part of the workday. But here, looking for orders was the norm, seemed to be the norm. And so what I'm saying, the second prescription is that if demand is captured flexibly in this way, that it's not just the meal times that are peak, but there are all these other times that are identified as peak. And it's interesting to note that platforms also push customers at the same time. Like you would have noticed on your phones that if you have any of the delivery apps, that they would constantly nudge you to order around meal times, or if it's Diwali, the push notification will say something about it being Diwali and how you should order food, and so on. So it's interesting that they sort of attribute a greater peak to customers, but also are actively involved in creating the peak around certain times. And finally, so the last bit that I want to sort of speak about in terms of the prescription of use of time is that this use of time is enforced by the platforms, but it's based on customers' existing and anticipated demand. So in that way as well, they perhaps distance themselves from the surge by saying that this is just an already existing natural fountain of interest in our service. Also, much like Mr. Patwardhan's painting, who in the beginning he stands within the city to look at the city, and then stands within the house to look at the city. So I'm now beyond the report. Now I'm interested in looking at platforms, but from the household. So for instance, I'm curious to see how are platform customer relations built, and how might an understanding of those relations speak to what we already know about platform worker relations. And also because platform worker relation it hinges not just on the customer platform, but also on inter-platform relations and platform restaurant relations. So that's just a quick word on some future directions I might be moving in. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Simran. In the interest of time, I think we should do all the presentations and then we'll have a Q&A or a discussion. So for people listening in, as and when you have questions, please Either note them down or drop them in the chat, and we will have a discussion once all the presenters are done. We move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Yeah, is this visible?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm just going to follow Simran's lead on that. So today I'm going to be talking about the fieldwork that I did in somewhere in 2019 in the ride-hailing economy in Mumbai. I want to begin my presentation with this small anecdote from from a conversation with one of my respondents. So during in the beginning of my field work, I spoke to this one driver who responded to this question of, I asked him, taxi chalana kaisa lagta hai? How do you like driving a taxi? And his response to that was sort of it seemed like he took offense when he said that I don't drive a taxi, that मैं taxi नहीं चलाता हूँ. So immediately I followed it up with the question कि Uber चलाना कैसा लगता है? So and his response to that was अच्छा लगता है, मजा आता है, that I enjoy driving for Uber. So why I'm sort of starting my presentation with this anecdote is because some of the subtexts in this exchange I did not understand until much later, till I sort of made sense of the rest of my data and started looking at the things that other drivers had said and started contextualizing it with the broader landscape, urban landscape of Mumbai. But what I would like to sort of now talk about is some narratives that were really dominant around the time we did this research. One of the biggest narratives around the platform economy was that of disruptive innovation. And the rhetoric around this sort of framed this work, form of work, as novel and unprecedented in terms of what it can do for the economy, but also for the social and cultural makeup of the city. So aggregator platforms like Uber and Ola and many others after them have argued that they offer a solution for formalizing the informal economy in a way that benefits all. Ride-hailing and cab driving work through these platforms has been also framed as a solution for low-skilled work like driving and things that others have also covered in their presentations up till now, and also the unemployment that exists in these sectors. So platforms step in as matchmaking entities, arguing that they simply match the riders to the passengers. But both in our project, in all of our field research and other research on the gig economy, scholars have insisted that this is really not the case. There is much more to platforms than a simple story of matching demand to supply and making that process more efficient. The substitution of the old by the new doesn't occur in a clean-cut fashion, and in fact, there are many historical continuities that these platforms claim to have done away with, which continue to persist in the operational realities of the platform economy. So Mumbai is one of the oldest cities in India to have had taxi cabs as a regular feature of the urban landscape. And the platform economy in Mumbai capitalizes on this historical context in more ways than one. So in my fieldwork, I found that a large majority of drivers who work for these platforms, in fact, had some kind of linkages with the erstwhile forms of taxi driving. Many of the drivers that I interviewed had experience working for other platforms that preceded these particular platforms, such as Meru or Cool Cab. And either that or they came from families where taxi driving was an intergenerational profession. Further, a large majority of drivers were male Muslim migrants, which is also the kind of workforce composition that existed for the Kali Pili cabs or the black and yellow cabs that have existed in Mumbai. And another sort of promise that the platforms had that existed in the rhetorics of disruptive innovation was that the middleman is going to be now non-existent in the new forms of work, and like formalizing the informal economy will in fact involve that quite prominently. But in my research, I found that the middleman still continues to exist, and there are fleet owners and managers who work as non-driving partners with these platforms. So what I intend to do with this presentation is to sort of look at when we are trying to understand how the platform economy promises to bring order to the informal economy. We should also follow it up with the question that what and who is being ordered and who is being regulated as a result of that. And what do these narratives of disruption and innovation mean for the drivers? And what are their implications, like what are the implications of these new forms of work for the workers who work in these professions? So in the presentation today, the two themes that I'd sort of like to touch upon are flexibility and risk. While I've used them to sort of organize my research, I'm directly drawing them from the concerns and the negotiations that drivers make in their everyday lives and the words that they use to articulate these concerns. So a little bit about the fieldwork and how the study was done. I did the fieldwork from January 2019 to May 2019, and it was a qualitative ethnographic research wherein we mapped the field as we were studying it, and also keeping in mind our own social locations and the power hierarchies that we were embedded in with respect to our respondents. So I interviewed, my respondents came from these five sets of respondents that you can see on the left. I interviewed driving partners or cab drivers who were directly attached to the platform or to a fleet owner. Then there were non-driving partners, as I mentioned earlier, who included fleet owners predominantly with multiple cars attached to the platform that they not necessarily, they didn't drive themselves, but also on some occasions they had to drive those cars themselves to make sure that the business was kept running. The third set was representatives from the platforms, either managerial or service staff professionals at the platform service centers or help centers. And the fourth set is worker unions that Uber and Ola drivers had formed in Mumbai around the time. And the fifth set is from the representatives from firms that provided automobile finance support within the platform economy. So the recruitment for these respondents was done through several ways. The primary way that I did that through was through social media groups on Facebook or on messenger apps such as Telegram and WhatsApp. Some of these groups were run by the unions, and some were run by individuals who had large amounts of experience in working in the ride-hailing economy. So they sort of became savior figures in these groups as well as elsewhere physically for drivers. From there on, I started to reach out to drivers through snowball sampling and through the union communities that I had established contact with. I also spoke to the drivers that I was matched with through the platform, and I also spoke to the company representatives by visiting their offices and platform help centers. So coming to the first theme, what I'll try to do here is I've tried to draw a contrast between what the platform promises and what the drivers effectively get. So the platform promises entrepreneurial freedom and autonomy. The running narrative around that is that you can be your own boss. But in effect, like through my research, what I've found is that there are new economic opportunities that are available to workers now, but there are also mounting financial costs and debts that they incur as a result of having been involved in this work and having left their previous jobs, most of which have, like most of the workers that I spoke to came from service economy kinds of jobs. So the debts are also quite hefty. The next bit that I want to talk about is that the platform also promises flexible work routines, similar to the things that Simran described with respect to food delivery work. The idea within the ride-hailing economy is also that you can work from whenever at any point of time in the day, and like you can customize your work routines according to your own convenience. And the drivers sort of agree, like most of my respondents sort of agreed with this idea that yes, there is freedom to move. Yes, they can go wherever they want, and they actually do enjoy that kind of flexibility. But the downside of that, and it's a pretty important downside, in fact, that they do have to work really long hours and their work schedules do become uncertain, which is something that they realize much later after they joined, after they started working for these platforms. And it has led to a lot of resentment. At least at the time that I was speaking to them, they felt a lot of resentment against the platform companies for not having prepared them for this kind of a lifestyle. Similarly, the platforms, like I said, promise economic growth for all, that they say that anyone can drive an Uber, and it's not restricted to any of the previous social categories that one may identify with. It's literally open to anyone and everyone in the city, whoever, but the subtext of course here is that whoever has the means to be able to do this. And the related finding with respect to this is of course that there has been an expansion of the workforce through some of the fleet managers that I interviewed were in fact, they had government jobs, and for them it was actually a side gig. But the key point to note here is again that they were fleet managers and they didn't necessarily drive the vehicles themselves. And they still employed workers who still fell in that specific demographic that has traditionally been associated with taxi driving work. And the last bit that is associated again with all forms of platform work, but specifically with respect to the ride-hailing economy as well, that the quality of service is supposed to be improved drastically as the drivers are supposed to be like well-groomed and extremely well-trained service professionals. So the finding that I've correlated with this sort of is this idea that they do get acquainted with these with new kinds of technologies, and there is an opportunity to familiarize themselves with digital payments or with the way that certain kinds of apps work, with Google Maps also in particular, which is a really heavy part of their job. But the downside again is that there is no training that is provided to any of the workers to make this process easier. And when questioned about what are their future aspirations or what are the key takeaways from this kind of work, most of them said that there are very limited opportunities for any kind of meaningful skill development in this job. And if they do decide to sort of move away from this sector, they'll probably do something entirely different and will not have a lot to carry forward from this work into their next job. Some of the ground realities that I'd like to highlight with respect to my project is that the key idea is that the drivers' flexible movements across the city provides the platforms with a lot of important kinds of data, not limited to geospatial data. In fact, there's a lot of experiential knowledge that the drivers provide which helps better the platform, which helps the platforms consolidate their power in the urban landscape. But the value that the drivers get from this kind of an arrangement is actually quite limited. So it's important to highlight the stark contrast between the kinds of value that is derived from these new forms of works for the workers. The second bit is that drivers also often struggle to access like basic facilities such as drinking water, food, and washroom facilities. Some of my respondents actually told me that they do carry, like drinking water might still be easier, but their food consumption is all over the place. They eat at odd times of the day, and accessing washrooms is in fact like really difficult. Some don't want to pee, some don't want to sort of like to use like public spaces to do these kinds of things, and it might be difficult for them to get access to public washrooms and like proper facilities around this. So that's a really big issue for a lot of the drivers. The third point is that there is absolutely no support from the platform in emergencies or at nighttime, or if there are any conflicts that drivers run into on the road with traffic policemen or with customers or any other kinds of like issues that the city throws at them, or for the regulatory compliances that are mandated for running tourist vehicles in the city. They have to either rely on immediate surroundings, or maybe if they're working with a fleet owner, then they can help them out, or ultimately on other drivers. And extended working hours and no fixed schedules then often translate to deteriorating mental and physical health. While I was doing my fieldwork, there were several reports of suicides and worker strikes, which are still slightly more extreme, but the everyday reports of accidents on the road, drivers being angry and getting into sort of violent conflicts with customers were pretty common. And I heard a lot about them from almost all of my respondents. I'd also asked them questions about how their bodily health was being affected due to this kind of work, because if they drove like 16 to 18 hours every day in a sitting position, so that definitely leads to some kind of back issues. And although drivers do have some ways to sort of tackle that, but to think of it in the broader context of the form of work, I think it's an important consideration to think about worker health as well. And the last point around this is to also then talk about how drivers then form their own networks, and uh, like the unions and the messenger groups and all of these online networks that I found were the places that drivers found potential work opportunities and found ways to support each other to continue doing this kind of work. So yeah, the last bit that I'd like to talk about would be about the risk transfer. Um, um, yeah, so the risk transfer that happens within the platform economy like revolves around two main ideas. One is that the safety and security measures for drivers are absolute, like I said, that they're very abysmal. There's a very abysmal state of safety and security measures available for drivers. The onus of solving a real-time crisis is actually on the driver. And some of my respondents also actually told me that narrated these kinds of incidents where they ran into certain kinds of issues with the traffic police or with their customers who threaten to sort of beat them up as well. And while for customers, there are these SOS features that are available, and they can sort of reach out to the platform. But the kinds of conflicts that occur with respect to the drivers, they don't have any of these features available. And when they do try and reach out to these to the helplines that are provided to them, they're met with sort of responses that ask them to handle the situation on their own. And the second point around this is to talk about the gendered risks. I've also, like some of my respondents also told me how they were in a relatively like they were in situations where customers made inappropriate advances towards them. So the kind of relative position of power that puts them in is also sort of needs to be understood in more detail. Another thing that like I've also written elsewhere around how there is a gender there's a gendered power hierarchy that drivers are embedded in vis-a-vis upper class female customers. So those are also some of my findings. And the last bit that I'd like to talk about with respect to risk transfer is there is like the platforms are no longer sort of responsible for providing social security and welfare measures for drivers. So hence there is no kind of job security and no savings that the drivers can rely on. There's this constant fear of being sucked into a debt trap as earnings deteriorate. And all of these are again like why I call this a risk transfer is because the platforms transfer these responsibilities onto the individual workers by way of like calling them micro entrepreneurs or partners who are associated with the platform. Similarly, some of my respondents also spoke about how the kinds of tie-ups that these platforms had with third-party organizations or NGOs often came with some kinds of strings attached to them or some kind of hidden conditions that weren't revealed to them beforehand. And most of them, like even if there was some kind of support provided for, say, educating drivers' kids, there would be conditions attached to those facilities that made the workers ineligible for those schemes. And lastly,
you might have to wrap up in a minute.
Right. I'm almost done. Yeah. So lastly, the only thing that I'd like to sort of end with is that the pandemic is an important context that we have to read the platform economy with now. And when I did my fieldwork, drivers already had declining earnings, which have become much worse during the pandemic. And especially in Mumbai, the migrant labor exodus was pretty harsh, and that included a lot of taximen and cab drivers also going back to their native homes. We've also seen reports of like continued apathy by platforms, which uh, when they've promised like safety gear and sort of like protective screens between drivers and customers, they seem to be inadequate, and drivers are still at risk. And financial support is also pretty abysmal. So two last bits that I wanted to talk about. There was this sort of premonition of these disasters that some of the anecdotes indicated during my fieldwork. Around the strikes, when I was speaking to a couple of workers, there were variable perceptions about the strike amongst the workers. Some considered it as a necessity, but some viewed it skeptically as well. But most of them had this pragmatic response that they had to participate in the strike because otherwise their cars would be damaged and it would be bad in the long run for their businesses. But one particular anecdote that stuck with me was about this one respondent who told me that how daily wage workers suffer during these kinds of disasters because his earnings declined to a point where he had to stop consuming meat. And that was quite telling, and that kind of a disaster has been universalized during the times of the pandemic. Similarly, health concerns during the time of the pandemic are don't enable drivers to either stay at home or keep working because they can't afford to get COVID, but they also can't home isolate. So these are no longer restricted to the individual, but experienced at a much larger scale. And in the report, I go in some more detail, organizing these ideas around three key typology, where I talk about spatial and temporal labor, affective emotional labor, and infrastructure and data labor. That these are the forms of labor that drivers perform in the platform economy. Yeah, thank you. That's it from me.
All right. Sarah, are you ready to go?
I am just 1 second. Instead of me sharing the screen, I've asked Simran to share on my behalf my presentation. Just a moment. I'm having
Also, Sarah, where you are, there's a lot of background noise. Is it possible to move to a slightly quieter place?
Is it better now?
Yes.
Simran, could you just share your screen? I have sent you my presentation.
Sure, just 1 second. I'm just downloading it. Can you see it, Sarah?
Yes.
Great.
It's just, it looks too zoomed in, I think.
Is this okay? Should you want me to?
This is okay. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm talking about the unbearable likeness of pain, precarity in cab driving in Delhi. We conducted, as part of the same project, field work somewhere around in 2019. When I first uh, entered this project, I came from a background of journalism, and my knowledge of platform drivers was entirely around earnings and revenues and general discussions on safety, security, the kind of things we read in newspapers essentially. When I started reading up literature, a lot of it was also very celebratory, where people were taking up gig work because it was empowering and because it was the best thing that was possibly happening to them. And these are the kind of notions with which I went into the field. When I started studying it, I realized that a lot of information does not about drivers does not come from them. So when we try to understand, both users and non-users tend to base their understanding on experiences we have with companies. So our assessments about how Uber is better, Ola is better, or the messaging employed by those. In this set of tripartite relationship, the privilege of agenda setting then goes with the company, and they may be able to respond to this through campaigns or through social media alerts or ads. But those who are actually offering these services and the ones who are actually interacting with everyone are the least privileged in that sense. This is not to say that platform workers lack agency, will, or voice, but to suggest that the constraints of the structure of gig work are such that we often don't hear from them. And in that sense, this whole discussion, which is influenced by journalistic reportage, is where I was coming from and where I was going in. Can you move to the next slide? Simran, for some strange reason, it seems like a very constricted. Is everyone able to see full screen? Because on my device, at least, I can't see the screen fully.
Yeah, I can see it fine.
Okay, cool, cool. Okay, if everybody else can. Okay, so I went in asking three questions. How are cab drivers perceiving their work? What are their costs of performing everyday ride hailing? And what are specific features of ride hailing in Delhi? Say, how is an Uber driver in Kota or Pondicherry different from an Uber driver in Delhi? My field report is based on observations and semi-structured interviews with 15 cab drivers. I also interacted with the secondary layer of those working in these companies, especially customer kiosks at metro stations and service centers in Gurgaon. I also recorded observation at sites, which are, say, some by lanes with free parking space in VIP area in Lucknow, Delhi, and petrol pumps and CNG stations. I was also taking rides of, say, an average duration of 40 minutes across different parts of the city. Of my 15 respondents, 8 drove for Uber, 7 for Ola, and they can broadly be classified as career drivers who some of those were also people who migrated from non-driving jobs into the business. For Ola, 2 out of those 7 owned the cars they were driving, while the rest had leased from the company. For the Uber drivers, 7 owned the cars, while 1 had borrowed on lease. All my respondents were in the age group 25 to 40, and except 4, all were migrants who had moved to Delhi sometime in the last decade. Initially, I would have very unstructured discussions with them, but eventually we decided to get to specific themes. And what struck me was that this entire conversation was being held by that one rear view mirror, because I was not doing a sitting across a table kind of respondent interview. But they were right. I'm sitting in this card like setup, and this in that moment, often I noticed that drivers were not drivers are fairly reluctant to say bad things or negative things about customers, which is what I eventually got to. And there was an element of hesitation that they've experienced. But I also realized that this kind of mobility induced subversion in this method allowed me to record a lot of postscript. So whenever the next ride was about to come in, there would be calls and notifications, and this allowed me to observe how drivers reacted to the allocation of rides. Next slide, please. Right. So I would start framing my questions in terms of working hours and earnings, but drivers across used one word in every single conversation to describe that entire range of motivation, aspiration, and ambition, and that was mehnat or toil. If there was just one thing that I asked them to thrive in this business, everybody singularly said it was mehnat. Now, what would mehnat mean? Mehnat came across to mean a sense of control over earnings, a sense of guarantee that if you were on the road, you were to get work, and most importantly, a very conscious sense of absence of slavery that a lot of people who were previously in other kinds of jobs had experienced. So consciously merit also meant that they were spending good 12 hours on the road, but unconsciously it meant that drivers were also kind of experiencing a cost, and that toil was taking on their body. One of my respondents said that 100% there is money to be made in this line, but you can only make money if you are on the road all the time. And a lot of my respondents also were very confused about whether they were going to own the cars or not own the cars, but they said that we are motivated to just make money. And the word they used was lut. And I mean, and natsha, words that I have struggled to kind of translate exactly, that the desire to be on the road came from a sense of lut or nasha. And hence, it was absolutely not desirable to spend any time away from the road. Next slide, please. Those who were leasing their cars were paying a rent of roughly 1,000 rupees a day, and the average figures for gas and maintenance related expenditure amounted to about 500 to 700 rupees a day. All drivers said that they aim to make at least 2,000 to 3,000 rupees per day after putting in 12 to 15 hours. Many of them drove 7 days a week, and the word they used was that they preferred not to take leaves or breaks even during the day. On one of my rides, I met someone at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and he told me that he had left home at 8 a.m. and had not had a chance to have lunch. So I asked him why did he not take a break, and he said we can take a break, but we don't need to. Another driver described it as being a habit to not take breaks because again the idea of nasha, that the moment you spend a single moment away from the wheel, it means you're losing out on money. So the ideal way of working was to spend as little time away as possible. It is difficult to arrive or calculate a per minute earning figure in that sense, but in drivers' imagination, every single minute of being on the wheel was linked to the idea of earning. And their general notion was काम आएगा, but we should be on the road. However, that does not mean that drivers were motivated to take just about any ride that was allocated to them. 50% of them said that they preferred knowing the destination in advance, so they generally waited for passengers to call or at least call themselves. In at least 3 rides which I took, the phones bust with next allocation, which drivers declined, saying they would take bookings only after they were sure they had dropped me off. Uh, Most of them said they did not take elaborate lunch breaks or did not take specific time-based lunch breaks or any other breaks. Um, for many of them, this discussion on long working hours presented a sense of contrast because those who had been career drivers said that if long hours meant more money, they were up for it. For the first time, they felt a sense that they could assess their worth on the basis of the intensity of working hours rather than earlier fixed salaries. Including people who were earlier working at offices felt that they did not have to report to anyone, and the sense of freedom of not talking to a boss was a significant relief, irrespective of the nature of earnings. And one of this quote that I share on the screen is from a person who used to previously work for Axis Bank and who said that he was spending 12 hours at his job, but here even his commute was yielding cash. Next slide, please. uh, I thought of exploring that if one were to make an inventory of cost of someone who's entering this platform system, what amount of money does one need to have in their pockets before they can just join? And from apart from the regular typical costs that would be say car purchase or lease or EMI, there was the cost of commercial number plates, which in some cases were costing up to 1 lakh. There was insurance cost, there was smartphone costs. Several Uber drivers said that the company advised them to carry 2 phones, one for navigation and one for calling. Apart from that, because they were driving in Delhi and had to navigate across NCR, they were required to pay interstate commercial taxes to 2 different state governments. Further, they said that one must be able to secure space and safety for parking the car at night, a constraint both financially and spatially, especially for those who are living in shared apartments, often in the marginalized or the far-flung parts of the city. Over and above, any damage caused to the car due to driver actions, irrespective of ownership, would be paid by the drivers, as would be the police challans. So majority of the drivers admitted that they would avoid haggling with the police, as it was better to get off with a 100 rupees challan than be given a court challan where one had to personally appear before a magistrate, which would eat into their entire day's savings. Additionally, there were requirements like an SOS button system that were necessary to be worn by the driver. There's one driver I went with, that was his first day in the car, and he told me that he was unable to work for 2 weeks because Ola had refused to accept the car without the SOS button, and that alone costed him 15,000 rupees. Another cost incurred was of the more recently, Uber had started a go to home option where if a driver could key in their home location, they would likely to get rights in that location. But even then, it wasn't the most straightforward or financially appropriate move for drivers because this one driver I met had put the go to home option, and which is why he received my ride. But my house was good 8 kilometers away from his house. Similarly, another driver who lived in Gurgaon said that after 10 p.m., it was very difficult to find a ride to go back to home. And even if he did get a similar ride, it would be too far from his own home, but he had no choice but to accept the ride. The other set of costs that were coming in were more embodied costs, which is again, like I said, that riding across NCR means you drive across three states with their own local transport rules. So, for example, the government of UP charges a commercial tax to allow vehicles with yellow plates to fly, and this is a monthly cost which has to be borne by drivers. Similarly, if this also means that because you were forced to comply with three states and there could be some kind of gap, you could be hauled by the police of three states. So this one person who was driving a car in UP told me that Haryana government was allowing cars that had the highest security number plate, and therefore he was being challaned multiple times. But when he went to his RTO in UP, because that is where his car was registered, they said no such rules exist in UP, so we can't issue you a number plate. This person, then there was another driver who had a similar problem, but because his own car was a second-hand car, he felt that this was a problem that, as because he was not the owner, he couldn't resolve. Similarly, drivers were aware of the fact that they had to constantly get a sense of how to avoid police. So they would have a sense of where checkpoints are and they would avoid such routes. At least four drivers told me that they avoided Gurgaon during summer afternoons because less traffic on the road meant greater probability of being stopped by the police. One of the drivers who drove me to Gurgaon in the afternoon asked me if he could take a detour from the navigation specified route, as that would mean bumping into police checkpoints. So when we discuss earnings and eventually move to more explicit problems with the work, drivers did say that they felt that a lot of this was hard on their bodies, but it did seem worth the effort because of the money they were making. Only three drivers said that not only this work meant being in the same position for hours, but they were also constantly required to be on guard physically and mentally, and the clutch brake routine did feel physically overwhelming. Next slide, please. Uh, this There is a sense of inherent contradiction in how the entire system was in place, because when I would ask basic questions like how did rides get allocated, or how do you know this ride cost this much, or how are ratings determined, these are some questions that drivers had absolutely no answers for. And it is not to say that algorithms were uh, were having real life implications, because for instance drivers couldn't refuse rides easily. So if a driver had planned that they are going to make 2000 rupees, then they cannot come up with a straight calculation that they will take 10 rides of 200 bucks in the day, because they don't know how much the next ride will yield, which means they will struggle to refuse rides easily. And a lot of drivers then could not plan their day in terms of the number of trips they wanted, but were ending up scheduling target earnings. The other problem that a driver pointed out was that in an ideal place, given that Uber had options for smaller cars, the hatchbacks, the sedans, the driver pointed out that often he was driving a sedan and he would be forced to go to very narrow congested lanes. And he flagged that algorithms should have a sense of knowing that a certain location is narrow or has congestion, then big cars should not be given. But since he was getting bookings, he was often having to say no because he was struggling to maneuver in such geographical locations. The drivers also pointed out that unlike other methods like say auto rickshaws in Delhi or even the Kali Pili cabs, drop locations were always negotiated beforehand, so were fares. And a driver said that because apps did not encourage people to disclose exact locations to drivers, the entire process of them calling up before a ride meant that often passengers would get angry or suspicious as to why this kind of interrogation is being done even before the ride is beginning. Next slide, please. I theorize sense of not knowing to this sense of not knowing translated into the drivers inventing their own set of explanations, which I theorize as the algorithmic gut. So whenever I would ask them about ratings, I have received a range of explanations. One driver told me that only five-star customers get five-star passengers, and I have never been a five-star passenger. I don't know why, but anyway. And other drivers said that only people who were completing 200 kilometers a day were getting the five-star customers and things like that. All of which are difficult to verify for me, which made me realize that the drivers are not necessarily looking or having legitimate or verified information, but have created these spectrums, these scales of assessment against which they're constantly trying to make sense of everything that they don't know. So one set is that, for example, they said that in the afternoon there is no work in Gurgaon. The word they used is kam madda in Gurgaon during afternoon. And because non-peak hours also meant that intermittent work, some of them said that non-peak hours mean that they will get short rides within Gurgaon, which again exposed them to the police more, which they wanted to avoid. Another set figured that they avoided Noida late in the night because they felt unsafe passing through patches of specific areas. Without the drivers expressing this explicitly, I detected a sense of constant evaluation and assessment that they were applying not only to identify the most profitable ride, but also to maintain a sense of self preservation where they could also maintain their own safety. And the fundamental idea was to have a ride that exposed them to least troubles and those troubles could range from the police to potholes or congested lanes. Knowledge of this cost that the form of employment brought with itself conflicted directly with their urge to constantly be on the road in search of more rides. So while the drivers did say that they want to be on the road all the time, they were also actively looking for reasons that would make being on the road difficult for them. So this contradiction also informed their long-term ambitions, but everyday work was so risky that they had to reconcile themselves with the idea of cost efficiency. This constant distinction between mehnat as a motivation for financial gain and mehnat that was bringing a steep bodily cost is not something that is clearly articulated by drivers themselves, but something that I figured that they experienced. Next slide, please. Which brings me to my conversation on risk. Every time I asked drivers, I framed question in terms of problem kya hai is line mein. The word that came to me from drivers was risks. Risk taking as a form of precarity is what I theorized it as in this case. One set of risk was about rogue customers, and drivers felt that risk was a variable. It did trigger some discomfort because they couldn't control it, but many felt that all jobs came with their own risk patterns, and as long as they had methods to mitigate or prevent it, it would work for them. The most important were rogue customers. The spectrum of unpleasant behavior by customers ranged from not disclosing the destination on the phone to fights during the ride to refusal to pay tolls and sometimes of accusing drivers of taking longer routes to outright financial fraud. All of my respondents had encountered at least one instance of passengers just refusing to pay fare. In instances described by drivers, they had lost nearly 250 to 2500 bucks from single day's earnings simply due to passengers' refusal to pay. Among the common causes identified by drivers, this included some people were just booking rides without checking cash in their wallets. Some didn't realize that toll payments were the responsibility of the rider, while some felt that they could get away without any punishment. However, the biggest grievance was the trouble created by passengers if the promised fare at the start of the journey was different from the actual fare. All drivers said that in peak hours, fares often not just surge at the time of this booking, but even during the ride, an unpredictable waiting time during a traffic jam only meant more fares. Many drivers said that they particularly avoided arguing with women drivers, especially when someone offered arguments like, "This is not what we pay daily." However, companies did not have too many guidelines to respond to this. While Uber asked drivers to call 100 or customer care, Ola did require the drivers to mandatorily call customer care. According to Uber drivers, the police were generally helpful in getting the fare and ensuring passengers stay, but it was not always effective, as drivers said that this meant going to the station and wasting time when it was mostly clear to them that the customer won't pay up. In the case of Ola, the customer care speaks to both parties on the phone and does try to address a dispute, but if that doesn't happen on site, the drivers are reimbursed the deficit and customers' IDs are blocked, which means they won't be able to book an Ola cab from the same number again. However, all drivers said that they knew this kind of behavior was part of the game and that they were mostly prepared for it. I just want to go to the next slide for a moment. Simran, could we go to the next slide, please? I mean, this driver lost 2,500 rupees because he picked up someone from Ghaziabad who went all over Delhi and then stopped for 10 minutes in CP and refused to come. And that day, this person kept calling. He didn't get any reimbursements from the company also. And I asked him that, what could you do about it? And he asked me, he said, "How would I know you don't intend to pay me when you look like an okay person making conversation with me?" And for me, this has been a very revealing insight because I did not realize that it is possible to kind of passengers were out there fleecing drivers. Could we go back to the previous slide, and then please? Previous slide, sorry. The one before this. Thank you. Out of 15 respondents, 10 admitted that they avoided driving late in the night as it was dangerous and preferred ending their day by midnight latest. Several drivers felt that post midnight, drivers were not only prone to theft by criminals who thought of drivers as being maldar parties or having cash on person, but also assault and ferrying drunk passengers. At least two drivers had bad incidents with drunk female drivers, and that had led them to police stations. Their coping strategies included avoiding specific stretches of routes, carrying a weapon sometimes, and mostly keeping someone on speed dial. So while the night was fraught with crime, the day was fraught with congestion. Six drivers said that they didn't really bother about any specific areas because being a driver meant they could drive anywhere. But they all said that Chandni Chowk was an area they avoided for sure. About eight drivers said that they preferred again narrow lanes, congested areas. Many of them said that they called customers and informed them that they won't be able to go if the choice is some congested lane. However, if there was a broader road close by as an alternative location, they could carry the passenger there. Next slide, please. Next. Uh, what does this then mean? Who is really the platform driver? The platform driver. One of my respondents used to work for Tata Projects, and I asked him what did it feel to transition from a job that was an office job to a cab driving job, and if was he in a position to further undertake any more transitions. And he said that the biggest problem with working for something like this was that one got used to the idea of getting cash in hand daily. He said that he often advised people to stay away because once they enter the business, it's hard to go elsewhere because you're so addicted to the idea of daily earnings. So they said that even if I drive for a company, I will only get paid at the end of the month. But here I barely needed to wait. And he pointed out that this worked for the company's advantage because this constant sense of lalach or greed meant that a constant supply of drivers was always on the road. This correlation between the individual driver's greed and the company's greed is what contributes towards maintaining a demand supply equilibrium. This marked shift in this attitude of assessing one's earnings and worth through time they put in working suggests that there is the rise of this entrepreneurial worker who wears his ability to toil on his sleeve, wants to make money, but will not do so at the cost of what they perceive as a damage to their dignity in the form of a manager's bickering. This perception is also aided by a strategic use of lexicon like words like cabs and taxi instead of taxi and drop instead of destination, which makes it seem like a new age and by extension a respectable profession. The two terms used by drivers in their conversations constantly, mehnat and gulami, not strictly antonyms, but used in a way to show approval. So while mehnat was acceptable, gulami was not acceptable. Next slide, please. So there is evidence that digital economy work is characterized by a series of asymmetries. There's value asymmetry, risk asymmetry, resource asymmetry, information asymmetry, power asymmetry. And here I've tried to establish the specific forms in which asymmetries play out for cab drivers in the following ways. Fares not determined by them, risk of financial and physical damage, lack of information due to algorithmic uncertainty, and finally, a lack of control over their long-term futures. What is also important is that given the skewed media coverage after the 2012 Uber rape case, safety becomes a dynamic that drivers negotiate on a daily basis in very different ways. So they are burdened by a dual responsibility to ensure their safety against criminals, but also fight an active perception as being perpetrators of crime themselves. This process is further complicated by the risk emanating from what should technically be the source of their safety and accountability, which is the police. And the costs of being a part of this system, even those are not which are not being borne by the company, are at least accounted for in the minds of drivers. But certain invisible costs, including the ones that their bodies take, are which are being borne to reduce risk and ensure safety, add a new layer of financial precarity to cab riding. In this case, the case of Delhi NCR, drivers identify and acknowledge that the toil that goes into this work is immense, but at the same time, many feel that this is better than the previous employment. Thank you. I ended this.
Thank you, Sarah. Ambika, Ayush, what do we do next?
Did you want to give a short response, and then if there's maybe just for 10 or 15 minutes, we can just after your response, we can just take a couple of questions and close at 7 IST, so in 15 minutes.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess rather than speaking directly to each of the presentations, the only thing I would say or add slightly from a slightly zoomed out perspective is that I mean, I really appreciate all the presentations and the amount of detail that they've given us. I also appreciate and I think that there's a larger conversation to be had around sites, methods, and different kinds of stakeholders in the platform or the platform economy broadly. Because I feel like as we build this field and as we figure out research and implications and so on and so forth in terms of what digital transformation platforms are doing um, to cities or urban spaces or societies and countries broadly, not just economies. There will be these questions also of figuring out the role of the algorithm, right? So like I felt like as Sarah's presentation most recently sort of talked about, there's a lot of ambivalence, confusion, and general uncertainty around the beast that is the platform. And that's not just the algorithmic object within, but also platform design, as Ayush mentioned earlier, um, as well as companies' own business logics when they try to establish a local market, which is also something that I had observed in my study of beauticians and wellness workers. And then a combination of venture capital things going on, et cetera, et cetera. So there are those macro forces, but there's also this element of the algorithmic unknown that I think factors into how we do ethnographic research and how do we sort of arrive at any sort of truth claims. I think is definitely something that keeps me up at night. So I was wondering if we can we can go into the discussion and question and answers, but maybe something that I would flag for all the presenters today is how did you, and I think some of these things also came up in the Q&A in chat by other people, is how did you configure your method as well as access? What kind of challenges to access did you face and how did you navigate or negotiate them? Not so much a response, but just something that I recently read and learned and heard, which definitely resonated with me was that I think in the adjacent field of algorithm studies or critical software studies, I think people are moving away from the direction of calling them black box systems or sort of trying to open up black box systems and finding either ways around it or even treating, as Nick Sievers called, treating algorithmic objects or treating platforms as objects of culture, right? And then seeing what kind of knowledge they yield when interrogated from different sites and from different dimensions. So I guess we've not reached yet in our discussion at a point where, in terms of how to reconcile or how to tie together, say for example, what a customer sees on their interface, what a worker sees at a certain time, because workers are also isolated by design, right? Because they often see a very different version of demand, supply, nudges, et cetera, even if they're in the same area. And then, as I learned from my study, when I did get access to the sort of back end of a platform in their warehouse, in their training centers, is that people working at different levels and hierarchies of the platform company also seem to have different narratives and different understandings of what is going on and how they're managing workers, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that was kind of the one point that definitely struck me. I also do think that based on all the discussions or the presentations that we've had today, maybe there is an urgent need to start building some sort of a media or evidentiary archive um, that doesn't sort of force us to to have to have a decision or a judgment or an insight on what's going on, because something that I grappled with in my dissertation research as well as through this project would be, I think some of you will definitely agree, is that we would come back with certain interviews with some people, drivers or food delivery people. And then if you weren't, depending on who you were in conversation with, people would also offer you their own accounts. either contradictory accounts or divergent accounts or accounts that sort of align with what you've seen and what you've recorded and felt. And I'm still kind of in the process personally to work out how do we collect and hold all these various accounts of the platform that emerge depending on, again, the algorithmic, the design logics, where the worker is, etc. Those, yeah. So how do we just collect and keep all that evidence and then maybe arrive towards a long-term analysis? I'm sorry if my audio isn't very clear. I don't know what's going on with my headphones, but I'll stop here and we can have the Q&A or a panel discussion.
Yeah, I think your voice was wavering a little bit, but I think we got most of it. I think maybe we can take some questions or comments from the audience as well. There's Shaila, I think, wants to make a comment. Shaila, please go ahead.
Thanks for all the presentations. This is wonderful work. I had a specific question for Simran, which was related to research methods, per se, in the whole future of work sector of studies. So, given the fact that time is very crucial to a good worker, how do we as a researcher, how do we convince them, how do we approach them and convince them to let us hang around for say a day or a couple of days and just make ethnographic observations? And there are two schools of thought on compensating people for participating in a research. I mean, one school of thought would say that it is important or it is preferable to compensate them, and another school of thought would say no, like that's taboo, that kind of practice. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you actually, I mean, if you want to if you want to address questions beyond just compensation as to how you gained access and how they let you hang around and just observe, that would also be great. And thanks once again for all the great presentations.
Thank you, Shaila. I think if I can just, I think it's much like other ethnographic work with daily wagers who are also time pressed. I think it's a matter of figuring out where in the rhythm people have some free time to speak. So for instance, I noticed after the lunch peak, there was like a post-prandial lull in orders. So in spaces like behind malls or in lanes, with lots of trees next to lanes that had restaurants, workers would just be, resting a bit, kind of lying down on their bikes or playing games on their phones. So I think it's a matter of recognizing where there was a lull in the day and then just, presenting myself there. But I also noticed that there was a lot of social media activity by workers. So not just like angry activity on Twitter about complaining to the company about not receiving payments or something, but also just like very regular social media activity. So I would often comment on those posts and ask if they were okay to speak to me. And then I also recruited a fair number of informants that way. I think another thing that Anushri and I actually did together, since we were both working in Bombay, we went to the Uber head office. So we just showed up. And generally, the experience that researchers have had with showing up to platform offices is that they don't get to get in. But because these were the Uber head office is an interesting space in Bombay because it's the head office, but it also is the office where the two-wheeler and four-wheeler riders both go for addressing their complaints. So we just stood in those lines and entered and managed to hang out and spend some time inside. And actually, we're actually working on an essay on how what platform offices do in the city. So I think there are lots of different entry points, and I feel like I may have dominated the answer a lot. I'm sure other people have lots to say as well. But those were some thoughts about access. The other quick thing I wanted to say about compensation was, I think since we did compensate our informants, I'm just waiting for Anushri and Sarah to nod in case I'm remembering incorrectly. Yeah, we did. We did because we had money that was there. So I think it was easy to, and also because people were, I mean, they were giving us time for no good reason. So we had money, so it made sense to pay a small amount, which we did. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for addressing that.
Any other questions, or did other panelists have things to add? Ayush, I saw you nodding vigorously to some of what Simran was saying.
Yeah, I mean, the office experience is quite, I mean, it is definitely worth visiting for most researchers. I mean, even for us, it was extremely hard to locate workers. So, I mean, so yeah, we also at one, I mean, towards the end of the data collection, did also like book gigs to be able to get more access. So, I mean, that is also, I mean, could be debated about like sort of, I mean, about like sort of the ethics around doing that and how to go about doing that, especially in cases where access is hard. But similarly, I mean, I think especially for the big platforms, the office space does operate as sort of, I mean, unintentionally, perhaps, but still as a site for workers to get together. I mean, sort of so informal ways of solidarity and collectivizing that happen there. So yeah, I mean, I've happened to be uh, at the urban club back office. I mean, there's a separate office for workers, and there's another one for yeah, for I don't know, for perhaps the sort of back end for the platform, and you know, that side of platforms. But there too, I mean, I mean, it's a contested site as well, right? As a researcher too, I would so I was trying to become familiar with one sort of cleaner on Urban Clap, and I mean, I had been speaking to him for about like 35-40 minutes, and he said that more of his friends and colleagues on the platform would be would be joining soon after their training, and they did join, and then I was speaking to them, and this became like an impromptu like FGD kind of thing. And that is when I realized that the person I'd been talking to earlier had I mean, had given me his wrong name. So there was that distrust that had colored that sort of approach and that conversation for a really long period of time. And it was only, I think, with the solidarity, with like the trust of his friends and colleagues, that they were like they grew comfortable enough to be having like sort of a conversation about, you know, what they're feeling. So I mean, they did think for the longest time that I was an urban company spy or something like that. So access does become a challenge, but I think it's also interesting to look at how sort of unions are emerging in the space, looking um, and I mean, two things also for on access. One is how unions have been approaching their collectivizing efforts, and the other is how platforms have been reaching out to workers. I think both of those been, I mean, have been successful to varying degrees, and I think could be used by researchers as well to get access.
I think Anushri had a quick point, and then we can close. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to add to both what Simran and Ayush were just talking about. I think similar perceptions, I'd experienced similar things when I was trying to approach specifically unions. And like around that time, there was a massive strike going on in Bombay. It was a very recent thing that happened. So there was like, in addition to me being perceived as someone from the platform, I think there was an added sort of emotional context around the strike. So which is why the distrust was probably higher, I guess, or maybe it's just become worse since after the pandemic. Like, I'm not very sure how that has progressed. But I think one of the things that we were discussing around that time was also to say, produce an affiliation document. And sociological studies, especially labor studies, have tried to do this kind of like, have used this kind of an approach to get access to unions who are like somewhere on like in between a formal and informal kind of an organization, structurally speaking. So I found that that was also quite useful. So one aspect of the like of doing this fieldwork was to hang out with workers, but another thing was, at least in my project, was to reach out to these organizations and sort of establish trust with them. So that document was also quite important. The point that I'm just trying to make is that it depends on who you're trying to gain, like whose trust you're trying to gain. So yeah, like those considerations as well. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, can I also add one small bit? I also went to the Uber Seva Kendra in Gurgaon, and it's manned by massive bouncers. It's manned by massive bouncers, and I tried to get in, saying they said only drivers are allowed here because you come in for your problems and troubles and paperwork. So the second time I went in saying I want to drive Uber, you just help me get in. I brought my driving license also, and which is how I managed to get it. It was like a regular government office vibe, very unlikely Uber, and like the small kiosks and counters where people had basically come with broken down cars. It was more like a place where if you had had accidents or your cars were taken in by the police or it were really old cars, you could get them serviced. But very little of actual support for drivers was being offered there.
Hey, thanks a lot, everyone. I think there's one person still has their hand up, so if we can take just a minute to hear from them, and then we can close for the day without any closing comments. I think we're well over time.
Riaz?
Yes, wait. Okay, Riaz, go ahead.
Hi, I'm really sorry for asking this question so late, and thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. I just wanted, I don't know whether you will be able to answer it right now or not, but the algorithmic, the entire, the concept about talking about algorithms and algorithmic imaginaries and all those things. I myself found it very difficult to talk about algorithms with the gig workers when we are doing the field work. Um, uh, the word algorithm itself is very alien to them. So I just wanted to throw this question out there, and I wanted Nupur and Simran's reaction to this, especially because I was doing some my study during the COVID in Pune in India. I was working with Zomato workers as well. So I don't know how to tackle with this concept of algorithms. It is in your head when you are doing the research, but when you go on the field, it is very difficult to talk about it with the workers because it's not a concept. So I'll just stop here for sake of time, but yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's wonderful.
I'll just quickly respond to that and say that I think that in itself is a very interesting question, because if you, rather than seeing it as a challenge, maybe I would see it, this is a very classic academic thing to do, but I still think there's some value to it, that if you can't call the algorithm or algorithms by that name, or it also signals to a certain a certain disconnect or a certain differential understanding of what you're looking for as a researcher who is aware of these technological objects versus what your informants also know experientially, right? It's not as if they don't know the system or what the other words they might be using to refer to the technological referent. So maybe you could begin by sort of, yeah, just mining it for like asking them questions about the platform, the system, the tech, the whatever. And also, I guess the side question is like, what is the utility? Even if you did manage to get some responses around whatever the thing it is, the algorithm that they all think about, uh, what is it doing for our understanding of, or their understanding of the gig work platform? And this is not rhetorical. I'm not saying that there's no utility. I'm saying that there might be some very interesting responses that might come in. And the final thing I would say is it reminds me of that wonderful play by Chanakya Vyas. I think it's literally called Algorithms. And it was definitely, pre-COVID, was staged in Bangalore. So that's when I saw it. But if you can find a recording or a copy, I would highly encourage everyone to watch it, because I'm assuming that that Chanakya is not a technical person, or at least the play isn't about what is an algorithm or what is the truth of algorithmic objects, but it really locates algorithmic effects and things that we can see, things that we can feel about this algorithm in our environments, in, say, for example, in Uber and Ola and stuff like that. I think we can end.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Riaz and Nupur. Thank you everyone for sticking through over 2 hours, and thanks again to the panelists for helping us organize and for all this wonderful research.
The report for the domestic work project is out already. The reports for the presentations by Nupur, Anushri, Sarah, and Sarah and Simran would be out on Friday. So the CS website is a space you should keep an eye out on. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.